We have inherited a fractured image of the medieval world. It is a tapestry woven with threads of shining armor and courtly love, of chivalrous knights pledging their lives to fair ladies, and of grand tournaments where a woman's favor was the ultimate prize. We think of Camelot, of troubadours singing ballads of unrequited passion, and of a code of honor that placed noble women on a pedestal of reverence. But this romanticized vision is a fragile illusion, a gilded surface that conceals a far darker reality. For while a knight might publicly dedicate his deeds to a lady, the legal and social framework of the age treated that same lady not as an object of worship, but as a form of property. Her virtue was not her own. It belonged to her father, and then to her husband. And while a nobleman's own infidelities were often a matter of public record, a mere whisper of indiscretion from his wife could unleash a system of punishment so brutal, so public, and so psychologically devastating that it was designed not merely to correct a sin, but to annihilate a woman's very identity. This is the story of what truly happened when a medieval woman was accused of adultery. It is a story that unfolds not in the pages of romantic poetry, but in the cold, unforgiving text of ancient law codes, in the grim records of local courts, and in the archaeological evidence of bones and forgotten instruments of shame. It is a journey into a world where a woman's life could be forfeit not by the judgment of a jury, but by the will of God as interpreted by the blistering heat of an iron bar. This was a world where a husband's jealousy could become a license to kill, and where a woman's face could be permanently mutilated as a walking advertisement of her transgression. This is the history of a terrifying hypocrisy and the unspeakable price women paid for a crime their husbands committed with impunity. The process of punishment did not begin with a blade or a pyre. It began with a ritual of social annihilation, a public spectacle designed to strip a woman of her name, her dignity, and her place in the community long before her physical sentence was carried out. The claim that a woman's reputation was public property is evidenced by the very nature of these shaming rituals. Her sin was not a private matter. It was a stain upon the entire village, and the village would become the instrument of her degradation. One of the most widespread methods was the use of the cucking stool or ducking stool. Town records from England and across Germanic Europe describe these devices in detail. The accused woman, often with little more than a rumor to condemn her, would be strapped to a chair affixed to a long wooden beam. She was then paraded through the center of the village, a captive audience of her friends, her neighbors, and her own family forced to watch. A procession was a festival of humiliation. The crowd was encouraged to jeer, to spit, to pelt her with mud, animal dung, and rotten vegetables. The procession would end at the local river or village pond. There, the beam would be extended over the water, and the woman would be repeatedly dunked into the frigid, filthy depths. The act was both a physical torment and a symbolic cleansing. The community, by immersing the unclean woman, was symbolically washing away her sin from their collective presence. Surviving such an ordeal, especially in winter, could lead to severe illness or death, but that was secondary to the primary goal, her absolute and public humiliation. An even more personal and devastating form of shaming was the shearing of a woman's hair. In medieval society, a woman's long hair was a powerful symbol of her femininity, her status, and her honor. It was, in a very real sense, her crown. Legal and literary sources, including the epic poem Beowulf, describe how a convicted adulteress would have her hair crudely hacked off in public. This act, often performed in the town square, was a visual declaration that she had been stripped of her womanhood. She was marked, her shame made visible to all, a scar she would have to live with for years as her hair slowly, if ever, grew back. It was a punishment that followed her long after the bruises from the public stoning had faded. These were not spontaneous acts of mob justice. They were calculated, often legally sanctioned rituals. The goal was to destroy her from the inside out, to make her an object of such profound contempt that she would become a living warning to every other woman in the community. She was no longer a wife, a mother, or a daughter. She was simply the adulteress, a social ghost in her own village. If a woman survived this social execution, her fate was often placed not in the hands of men, but in the hands of God. When a formal accusation of adultery was made, especially among the nobility, where inheritance was at stake, but concrete proof was lacking, the medieval legal system often deferred to a terrifying and uncertain process, the trial by ordeal. The claim that a woman's guilt or innocence was decided not by evidence, but by a horrifying appeal to divine judgment, is a cornerstone of early medieval jurisprudence. The logic was simple and absolute. God would not allow an innocent person to suffer. Therefore, a miracle was expected. The evidence for these practices is found in countless historical chronicles and legal treatises. One of the most common ordeals for women was the judicium feri candentis, the ordeal by hot iron. The process was deeply ritualistic, overseen by the clergy, which gave it the unassailable weight of divine authority. The accused woman would first fast and pray for 3 days to purify herself. On the day of the ordeal, a mass would be held. The priest would then bless a piece of iron, chanting prayers as it was heated in a fire until it glowed a terrifying red. The woman was then required to carry this red-hot iron bar for a set distance, typically 9 paces. After completing the walk, her hand was immediately bound in blessed cloth and sealed with wax. For 3 days, she would wait in agonizing suspense. On the 3rd day, the priest would unwrap the bandage in a public ceremony. If the wound was healing cleanly, without festering or infection, it was declared a miracle. God had intervened, and she was innocent. But if the wound was blistered, infected, and putrid, the almost inevitable outcome of such a severe burn in an age without antibiotics, she was declared guilty. God had spoken. Another common ordeal was the judicium aquae frigidae, the ordeal by cold water. The accused woman was bound, often with her right thumb tied to her left big toe, a position that made swimming impossible. She was then thrown into a river or pond that had been blessed by a priest. The logic here was cruelly paradoxical. Water, as the medium of baptism, was considered a pure element that would actively reject anything sinful. Therefore, if the woman floated, the pure water was refusing her, and she was declared guilty, to be hauled out and executed. If she sank, the water had accepted her, and she was declared innocent. The tragic irony, of course, was that she was often left submerged for so long that her innocence was proven only by her own drowning. This system was not an impartial appeal to the divine. It was a system ripe for corruption. A priest could subtly manipulate the outcome. The temperature of the iron could be altered, or the wound could be treated with certain salves before being bound. The length of time a woman was held under the water was entirely at the discretion of those holding the ropes. A woman's fate often depended less on God's will and more on her social standing, her wealth, or whether she had powerful male relatives to advocate on her behalf. This system began to fall out of favor by the 13th century, with the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 formally forbidding clergy from participating in such trials. But for centuries, it was a terrifying reality, a form of Russian roulette where a woman's life was staked on a priest's interpretation of a festering wound. For those found guilty, either by ordeal or by witness, the punishment that followed was often designed not just to end a life, but to permanently mark a woman as a sinner, destroying her social value for as long as she lived. The claim that the punishment was literally carved onto her face is a horrifying testament to the idea of a woman as property. The evidence for this is found in some of the oldest legal codes in Europe. The chillingly specific practice of rhinotomy, the surgical removal of the nose, was a common punishment for female adultery in many early Germanic societies. The Visigothic code, a set of laws from the 7th century, explicitly prescribed this punishment. Anglo-Saxon laws from England were no less brutal. The laws of King Canute the Great from the early 11th century declared that an adulterous woman should forfeit both her nose and her ears. The brutal logic behind this specific form of mutilation is clear. In a society where a woman's value was inextricably linked to her beauty and her prospects for marriage, destroying her face was a form of living death. It was a lifelong sentence of shame. A noseless woman could not hide her crime. She was a walking advertisement for the consequences of female transgression, a permanent object of disgust and ridicule. She could never remarry, never regain her social standing. This punishment was not about rehabilitation. It was about permanently devaluing damaged goods. It reinforced the idea that a woman's body, and specifically her beauty, was a commodity belonging to her husband, and any unauthorized use of it would result in its deliberate and permanent defacement. In some parts of Europe, the mutilation extended further. Accounts from medieval Iceland describe adulteresses having the letters of their crime branded onto their skin. In other regions, their property was confiscated. They were declared legally dead, and their children were taken from them. The goal was always the same: to isolate, to mark, and to erase. However, the ultimate expression of patriarchal control was not a punishment meted out by the state, but a legal right granted to a husband to become his wife's judge, jury, and executioner. The claim that a husband's jealousy could become a legal weapon is chillingly documented in the law itself. The Lex Salica, the ancient legal code of the Salian Franks from the early 6th century, provides terrifying evidence. It, along with other similar Germanic codes, contained clauses that granted a husband the right to kill his wife and her lover on the spot if he caught them in flagranti delicto, in the very act of adultery. He was required to leave their bodies exposed and to publicly declare his deed to the village elders. But provided he followed this protocol, he would face no legal repercussions. It was not considered murder. It was considered justifiable homicide. This was, in essence, a state-sanctioned honor killing. It gave a husband the power of life and death over his wife, transforming the marriage bed into a potential execution slab. The terror this must have instilled is difficult to comprehend. The home, which for many was the only sphere of influence a woman held, could become a legal abattoir at a moment's notice, based on the suspicion and rage of her husband. The hypocrisy of this system is its most damning feature. The same law codes that granted a husband the right to kill his wife for infidelity prescribed laughably minor penalties for his own. A nobleman who forced himself upon a servant girl might face a small fine, if anything at all. A king who kept a dozen mistresses was not seen as a sinner, but as a virile and powerful ruler. A woman's sexuality was a dangerous force that had to be contained and controlled for the sake of property and bloodlines. A man's was a right to be exercised. This brutal double standard persisted for centuries. While the most extreme laws of mutilation and justifiable homicide slowly faded into disuse in the later Middle Ages, they were often replaced by new forms of institutionalized cruelty. Accused women could be forcibly confined to convents, effectively imprisoned for life, their property and children signed over to their husbands. The methods changed, but the underlying principle remained the same. A woman's body was a vessel for her husband's lineage, and any deviation from that purpose was to be punished with the full unforgiving force of the law and the church. The story of the punishment for female adultery in the medieval era is a progression of horror. It begins with the stripping of dignity and ends with the taking of a life. It starts with the jeers of a crowd in a village square and concludes with the silent justification of a husband standing over the body of his wife. We see a system that was not designed for justice, but for control. The public shaming was a tool of social terror. The trial by ordeal was a theological lottery, heavily weighted in favor of the powerful. The acts of mutilation were a permanent branding of a woman as damaged property, and the right to kill was the ultimate expression of ownership. We must remember that for every famous story of a queen like Guinevere, there were thousands of forgotten peasant women whose names are lost to history women, who were drowned in village ponds, who had their faces carved away, or who were killed in their own beds by the men who had sworn to protect them. The chronicles do not record their names. The histories do not tell their stories. But the brutal laws they lived under and the few grim court records that survive speak for them. They tell of a world where a woman's greatest crime was to act as if her body was her own, and where the punishment for that crime was a descent into a hell on earth long before the one promised by the priests.